This egregious murder that happened, we can call it murder now, this egregious murder that happened, it should not be that it has to look like that in order for us to have some type of semblance of what people call justice. This was accountability, but it's not yet justice. Justice for us is saving lives.
Congresswoman's right. We can call it murder now. We can call Derek Chauvin a convicted murderer. And with us to talk about it are two friends of our broadcast. Baratunde Thurston, author, activist, comedian, former producer for The Daily Show with Trevor Noah. He is the host of the podcast, How to Citizen. He'll also be hosting the upcoming PBS series, America Outdoors, with Baratunde Thurston. And Jason Johnson back with us as well, a campaign veteran, journalist, contributor at The Grio. Most importantly, a professor of politics and journalism at Morgan State University. Gentlemen, good evening to you both. And Baratunde, by dint of the fact that Jason and I shared the moment in real time on live television earlier this evening, I'd like to begin with you tonight and your straight-up reaction to what we've witnessed today.
Relief is the word that I keep feeling that. It's not celebration. It's not exuberance. I don't have the energy remaining for that, but I am relieved. And unlike George Floyd in his last moments, thanks to the murderous actions of Derek Chauvin, I can breathe. And I've been taking very deep, grateful breaths today. Grateful for the jury, grateful for the prosecution, grateful for the witnesses who literally testified on behalf of the life of George Floyd, and grateful for the world, almost literally, the people who took to the streets in Minneapolis and across this planet to bear witness and demand something close to justice, something like accountability for this gross abuse of power.
Jason, our friend Eugene Robinson wrote this in the Washington Post under the headline, Derek Chauvin's conviction shouldn't feel like a victory, but it does. Quote, almost as important as the guilty verdicts is the fact that so many Minneapolis police officers, including Police Chief Arredondo, testified for the prosecution against Chauvin. Thin blue line solidarity probably isn't gone forever, but at least we know it has its limits. That's a start and hopefully a precedent. Do you join the hopefulness in Eugene's column, Jason?
Not at all. Because literally, Brian, when we talked earlier today, and I said, this doesn't make me happy, it's not satisfactory, it's not justice, this doesn't necessarily change unless there's some sort of radical reform in policing. And what happened 45 minutes later? Nakia Bryant, a 16-year-old girl in Columbus, Ohio, called the police for help. An officer was on the scene, and in 22 seconds, he shot her dead. An honor roll student who's making TikTok videos on makeup and hair. This hasn't stopped. And I want to be really clear about how critical this is, not just from the emotional standpoint, from the policy standpoint, and from the national standpoint. There is nobody in America who was not paying attention to today's trial. That means every single person in this country, every black person, every white person, every cop was paying attention to this trial. And still, 40 minutes after that ruling, a 16-year-old girl can be shot in front of her house. So, no, I'm not hopeful, because unless there is wholesale change, abolishment of this institution that continues to fail tax-paying black people in this country, everything else is just fanciful thinking. And whether it's somebody who was 10 minutes up the road, who was shot by an officer with 26 years of experience, or a guy, in Virginia who was an officer who pulled over, or honestly, Brian, who knows how many black men or women in America have a knee on their neck right now in this country, and we just don't have a camera to tell us. So until I feel safe, and I don't share Eugene's optimism. I share a pessimism that has been born of living in this country for way too long to believe that one trial is fundamentally going to change how this place operates.
Well, Jason, let me ask you about the young faces you look out on, because it's so important after hearing you out. And this requires speculation on your part. You teach at one of the great HBCUs. What are those kids likely to make of today's 3-0 verdict?
Tomorrow, when we talk on Thursday in the next class, they're going to be surprised because, as I mentioned earlier today, most of my students didn't think he was going to be convicted, even though I always thought he was in sort of a makeup call. But here's the problem. They're going to see that, And then they're going to think of Dante Wright. And then they're going to think of Ma'Khia Bryant. And then they're going to think of Tamir Rice. And then they're going to think of the slew of other young black people who have been killed where the police weren't held accountable. And I need people to sort of understand this. When someone dies, when there's a death like this, it's not just that person's loss, right? George Floyd's daughter she's not going to have her dad at prom. She's not going to have somebody to hug. When our cameras are gone, those people are still suffering. Ma'Khia Bryant, there's somebody who sits next to her in math class who's going to have nightmares for the rest of their life because a kid who they used to have lunch with and trade sandwiches with in the cafeteria is dead. That's how this looks to my students because they've grown up with this their entire lives. This country has an obligation to invest not just in the mindset and the economy, but in the lives of young black people. Because if we live every single day thinking that it could be our last, how can we actively participate in a country where we don't think that any day is promised to us because one officer having a bad day could end our lives?
Last summer, together with Senator Cory Booker and Representative Karen Bass, I introduced the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. This bill is part of George Floyd's legacy. The President and I will continue to urge the Senate to pass this legislation, not as a panacea for every problem, but as a start. This work is long overdue.
Indeed, as we've heard, even in our hour-long broadcast tonight, there are renewed calls for meaningful police reform, emphasis on meaningful, in light of the conviction of the officer who killed George Floyd. Still with us are our guests, Baratunde Thurston and Jason Johnson. Baratunde, we have a former president who takes his public role seriously. I'm referring, of course, to Barack Obama, who put out a lengthy statement tonight that reads, in part, true justice requires that we come to terms with the fact that black Americans are treated differently every day. It requires us to recognize that millions of our friends, family, and fellow citizens live in fear that their next encounter with law enforcement could be their last. And it requires us to do the sometimes thankless, often difficult, but always necessary work of making the America we know more like the America we believe in. Baratunde, your thoughts?
Yeah, leave it up to Barack Obama to remind us how to channel something positive out of something so dark in so many ways. And Brother Jason, hello. It's nice to share this screen with you. And I thank you for what you shared just before the break. I want to acknowledge you for that. And you broke some news for me, which I wasn't quite prepared to hear in terms of the events in Ohio. I am still practicing the breathing, and I want to acknowledge the rarity of this conviction. And celebrate not that, but to acknowledge that what I don't want to see is just more convictions of bad cops. What I want to see is less encounters that result in cops being able to abuse that power in the first place. What I want to see is us living in a world where public safety doesn't come down to overfunding and overarming underqualified people to handle every possible social challenge that they are not trained or don't care to learn how to do better. And the opportunity for meaningful reform, I think, has to get much more aggressive than that. I find some hope in the work of the Center for Policing Equity under the leadership of Dr. Philip Atiba Goff, who's worked with folks in Ithaca and Berkeley and hundreds of cities, scores of cities in between, to actively try to reimagine how we keep ourselves safe and how we don't have to keep relying on a system based in subjugation, based in violence, and based in non-compassion and non-mutual respect.
Jason, I was thinking in the break, this being our second conversation since the verdict today, people born with the gift of empathy are going to hurt hearing your hurt, hearing your hard-earned pessimism. And they may ask themselves or their loved ones, what could make it better? What could possibly make it better for that nice man on television? And what would you say?
Stop killing black people. I mean, like fundamentally, there's a point, Brian, if you think about like the parents who suffered in Parkland or Sandy Hook, right? And a lot of them reached that point where it's like, we don't want thoughts and prayers anymore. We want like gun control because we lost our kids. We'll never get those children back. We'll never get to hand them off to be married or anything else like that. That's how I feel. At this point, when I hear people say body cameras and training, that to me is passively saying you don't really care about the endemic death of black people at the hands of the state. That's the kind of thing that will make me better. None of these lies will come back. I don't want to see, as Baratunde said effectively, I don't want to see more convictions. I don't even want to see white people be mistreated in the same way that black people are mistreated, right? I didn't want to see Kyle Rittenhouse shot any more than I wanted to see Bakiba Bryant shot. What I want to see is policing that is actually just in this country. And I want to hear politicians say, this is unacceptable. I want politicians to have as much as zero tolerance for police violence as they did about sexual assault in the military. I want us to want to reform policing the same way that we changed the Department of War to the Department of Defense. We can do this as a country if we want to imagine it. But as long as people are continuing to say that this can be worked with, nah, I'm not going to be anything less than pessimistic, because this pessimism might possibly keep me alive.